Hello and welcome to another video lecture from MrWatkins.com. This particular video is titled Comparing Vertebrate Hearts. And basically what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the hearts of fish, amphibians, and the like, all the way up through mammals and aves, and going to compare their structure. Now, first of all, we're also all talking about or looking at vertebrate hearts here. And the deal is that vertebrates have some very specific characteristics. First of all, they belong in the phylum Chordata, which means they're going to have pharyngeal gill slits at some point in their life. They're going to have a notochord. They're going to have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, and they're going to have a postanal tail. And this all should be in either another video or in another lesson or notes that you've been given in class or on the website there. The second thing is that your vertebrates are going to have nervous system regulation, or at least some regulation of the heart by the nervous system. The other thing is that the hearts specifically are going to have at least two chambers. They're going to have an atrium and a ventricle, and those two chambers are going to be next to each other. Not like it might be in, say, a squid or an octopus where you might have multiple hearts. You might have multiple venous side hearts. You might have gill hearts or gill pumping vessels, and these things are separated from each other. It's all in one compact organ there inside the organism. So we need to go over a couple of terms here, and I'm going to use two different pencils to kind of describe some things here. So the blue pencil, and when I mark with the blue, what I'm trying to represent is blood that is deoxygenated. And deoxygenated in this sense does not mean that it does not have any oxygen. What it does mean, though, is that it has a lot less oxygen. It's not as saturated with oxygen as oxygenated blood, which I'll represent with the red pencil here. So the blood that's oxygenated is saturated, has a lot of oxygen in it. And typically what we see is that blood is the blood that's left, say, the lungs, or has left the gills, or another respiratory structure that allows for the diffusion of gases. Now, anytime a vessel brings blood to the heart, it does not matter if that blood is oxygenated or deoxygenated. If the blood is coming to the heart, it's termed a vein. And if the blood is leaving the heart, it's termed a artery. And so, again, it just doesn't matter what type of blood is being carried in that vessel. The vessel's name is based on the direction towards or away from the heart. And that's really important because there's some things that might confuse you a little later, and we'll get to that. So let's go ahead and get started here. First of all, this chamber, this is a fish heart. This chamber here, this one right here, is called an atrium. We have to change pencils. It is called an atrium, and the blood in this atrium has come from the body. So we have blood coming from the body into this chamber, and we have our body over here, and this body has picked up blood, or the blood has come from the gills. So blood that came from the gills. And when it got here from the gills, this blood basically was oxygenated here. And when it went to the body, that blood passed down in the capillaries, oxygen diffused out of those capillaries into the cells that needed that oxygen. Carbon dioxide diffused out of those cells and into the blood. And so we have a reduction in the amount of oxygen. So here's my deoxygenated blood. And so what shows back up here at the atrium is deoxygenated blood. And the atrium then only has to pump the blood in one small little amount right here to this ventricle. So this ventricle here has the deoxygenated blood in it as well. And this ventricle, this black here, represents that muscle. And the ventricle is very muscular, very strong, and it's going to send the blood out through this vessel, this vein vessel, or excuse me, this artery, this vessel, to the gills, so that this blood that had the oxygen removed back here at the body cells can then pick up some more oxygen and transport that oxygen to the body. So if you notice this whole system here, from the gills to the body, through the heart, back to the gills, a system of picking up the oxygen and a system of taking that oxygen to the body, is one circuit through the heart. So we say that this heart is a single circuit pump. Now, this artery here has a name, and you need to know this name. It's called the conus arteriosus. Conus arteriosus. And its whole function is to reduce the amount of stress that is being put on the vessels as the blood comes out. This ventricle, if you didn't quite catch it, this ventricle here has to push blood to the gills, down to small little capillaries so that gas exchange can occur. Then it goes through other vessels after the gills. The blood goes all the way to the different parts of the body. That's all the way down to the tail and all the way back to the heart. This ventricle basically is the thing that pumps the blood through the entire circuit that goes through this fish here. The other thing you need to notice is that there is only two chambers in this fish heart. There is an atrium and a ventricle, and that's it. There aren't any other chambers. So we have a dual circuit, or excuse me, a single circuit heart, because it only goes around once before it picks up oxygen and gets rid of that oxygen. And we have a two-chambered pump. So it doesn't matter whether you say it's a two-chambered single circuit pump or whether you say it's a single circuit two-chambered pump, but you need to know those two pieces there on that particular piece. Next we're going to do the amphibian heart. Okay, so now we have our amphibian heart. And it is believed that there was some common ancestor that had amphibian and fish-like characteristics, and that it was an amphibian that first moved, or that common ancestor that first moved from the water out to the land. So let's go through this amphibian's heart. Now, the blood vessel that's bringing the blood in here, this blood vessel is called a vena cava. Vena cava. And this chamber right here, this chamber is the right atrium. Now, how do I know right and left? When you look at one of these diagrams, it is as if you're looking at the organism. It's like if I was standing right in front of you. So, you know, its right-hand side is going to be basically on your left if you're facing it. But this is the right atrium. And then this blood ends up in this one ventricle. This one ventricle right here in the middle. And then the blood is going to go through this conus arteriosus. So it's going to go right through here, through this conus arteriosus. Don't worry about what this structure is quite yet. And then it's going to come back out and go to the lungs. Of course, if it's a tadpole, it'd be gills. It's going to come out here to the lungs. And out in the lungs, it's going to pick up oxygen, get rid of its carbon dioxide. And then this blood is going to come back in to this left atrium. And then it'll get pumped into the ventricle, then back through this conus arteriosus, and out to the body. And then out here at the body, that blood is going to lose its oxygen and come all the way back into this right atrium and start this process over. So we've got blood coming in to this right ventricle. We also, or excuse me, this right atrium. We also have a left atrium. So we have now two atriums. We have this ventricle. So now we have three chambers. So the blood's going to come in from the vena cava into this right atrium to the ventricle, then out to the gas exchange organ, in this case lungs. You could also make the argument for gills if it was a tadpole, or if it was a neotenic amphibian, and we'll deal with what neotenic means another time. But basically, bottom line is means it's juvenile. Here at the lungs, we're going to get the gas exchange, and so the blood then is going to come back to the heart. Now remember, in the fish, the blood went to the body. But in this case, this heart has two circuits. It has a circuit for the pulmonary side, the side that goes to the lungs, and it's got another circuit that goes to the somatic or the body side. Now, here in this conus arteriosus, right after that, we have a couple of structures that you need to be aware of, or arteries. So this is going to be the pulmonary artery. Find a good pencil here to write with. The pulmonary artery. And it's an artery that is going away from the heart, but it has deoxygenated blood in it. This vessel here is just going to be an artery. You don't need to know the big fancy name for that one. This vessel over here, because pulmonary means the lungs, artery going away, this vessel here is going to be the pulmonary vein. And that's because blood is coming from the lungs. It's coming to the heart. That's what gives it the vein. And because coming from the lungs, that gives it the pulmonary thing. Great question that seems to get asked a lot is, what's the only vein that carries oxygenated blood? Because typically we think that blood coming back to the heart should be deoxygenated. And that answer to that question is the pulmonary vein. What's the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood? And that's going to be the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood. The pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood, and which is, for some, they think it's kind of unusual. Now here we have a couple of problems. If both of these atrium contract at the same time, you're going to get mixing of blood. And that can be bad. And the reason why it's bad or considered bad is the fact that we're going to supply the body with blood that isn't saturated with oxygen. So how do we get around that? Well, there's a couple of structures here that help with that, or a couple of things. First of all, it's the contraction of these particular vessels that is important. So the right atrium contracts, then the ventricle contracts. The left atrium contracts, then the ventricle contracts. So we get this pattern of contractions in these chambers so that we don't get much mixing. And then the second thing is this spiral valve. That's what this thing is right here, is a spiral valve. This spiral valve moves or changes based on the amount of oxygen in the blood, so that if it's deoxygenated blood, the valve switches, closes off this artery, and the blood is going to go to the lungs. If blood comes to this spiral valve that is oxygenated, it's going to flip the other way and keep blood from going to the lungs, so it goes out to the body. So these two structures help this heart be effective in keeping the blood from mixing. So when we define this amphibian heart, we define it as having 3 chambers. We also define it as having 2 circuits. So I'm hoping that you can see these 2 circuits. I've got a red Sharpie here. I'm just going to outline the 2 circuits, so don't worry about the color. But I've got a circuit here that's going to the body, the one place it needs to go. And so there's that circuit, comes back. And I've got a circuit that's going to the lungs to pick up the oxygen. So we have it there. You can almost see a figure 8 here. You can see that the blood has to travel through the heart twice before it makes a complete cycle of picking up the oxygen from whatever respiratory structure and then taking that oxygenated blood to the body. We have a pulmonary circuit and a somatic circuit. This heart is a 3-chambered dual circuit pump. Or you can say dual circuit 3-chambered pump. But either way, you're describing the functionality, the physiology of this heart. So the next heart we're going to do is going to be what we used to call the old reptile group. Reptile is not really a name we use for taxonomy anymore. But it's a group of lizards and snakes and turtles. It does exclude crocodiles. They have something very special in their heart that we're going to show you in just a minute. So I'm going to change pictures now over to the reptilian, if you will, or the turtle, the snake, the lizard heart. All right, so this here is our turtle, snake, lizard, our reptile, if you will, heart. And you should be able to see the same structures that you've seen before. We have a right atrium here and a left atrium. We have our ventricle. We have a vena cava, and it's actually split in this particular diagram, that's feeding this right atrium. We also have another vein on the other side, a pulmonary vein, as well as a pulmonary artery. So let's kind of walk through this particular heart here. And again, I'm going to start with the right atrium. So this is the right atrium. And we have the vena cava. And there's one on the top and one on the bottom. You don't really need to know their big fancy names. And the right atrium is going to send blood into this ventricle. Now don't worry about this finger-like projection yet. And then from the ventricle, because this is deoxygenated blood, the blood needs to go to the lungs. And so we're going to go out this particular piece and go, artery, and we're going to come out here to the lungs. The lungs, we pick up oxygen as before. This particular vessel is going to be the pulmonary artery. This one here is the pulmonary artery. Once at the lungs, the blood is going to pick up oxygen. Oxygen is going to diffuse in, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out, and it's going to come back from the lungs into this left atrium. Left atrium, right here. So blood's going to pick up some oxygen, become saturated, come to this left atrium here, and then it's going to come back into the ventricle. From this ventricle, it's going to go back out this aorta, this artery, and it's going to go out to the body, where the oxygen is going to diffuse from the circulatory system, from those vessels in the capillaries into the cells. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of those cells into the capillaries, and then we're going to have a vein bring that back to the right atrium. So we basically have a very similar pump that we had before, where we have our two circuits. We've got a pulmonary circuit and we have a somatic circuit. The blood has to go through the heart twice to go through both circuits to complete one full cycle. So it's a dual circuit pump. We only have 3 chambers. Now there are some that say this is an incomplete 4. And they say that because there's this incomplete septum. That's what this is called, is a septum. And the way the structure is, and granted, or an intraventricular septum, but it's just incomplete. The way this is drawn is in a 2D arrangement as opposed to a 3D arrangement. And this septum really is effective. It's not perfect, but it is effective in helping separate out the oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. You can almost see that if this thing was joined together, we would end up getting a 4-chambered heart. Humans have a 4-chambered heart. They have a septum that is completely attached all the way up here. So this heart, still 3-chambered, but it is a dual circuit heart. So you could call it dual circuit 3-chambered pump. You could call it a 3-chambered dual circuit pump. That's the reptile, or the old reptile group, excluding the crocodiles. It's the turtles, the snakes, and the lizards. We're now going to go through the crocodile heart. It has something very special. All right, so here's the crocodilian heart. Crocodiles, alligators, caimans, basically those organisms. We've got our right atrium here. Okay. Again, with the deoxygenated blood. Blood's going to come into the right ventricle. I'm just going to put a little V there. And that blood again is deoxygenated. And I want you to notice right here, this septum completely separates out a right and left ventricle. Now we now have a divided ventricle. Now, blood comes out of the right ventricle and goes in through, or goes out the pulmonary artery out to the lungs. And just as it does in other organisms, the lungs, we have gas exchange, pick up some more oxygen, and now we're going to have that oxygenated blood come right back through the pulmonary vein. Remember, that's the pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, into the left atrium. So blood's going to come in here, and then it's going to come to the left ventricle, and then it's going to go back out to the body. I'll just draw it over here. Blood's going to come out to the body. Don't worry about this yet. Comes out to the body. Once it's out the body, then oxygen's going to be released into the tissues. Carbon dioxide is going to be picked back up, and it's going to get pumped all the way back to the right atrium. Okay, so we have our dual circuit here. We have 4 chambers. So we labeled this heart a dual circuit 4-chambered pump, or 4-chambered dual circuit pump, because we have 1 circuit through the pulmonary side and then back to the heart, 1 circuit through the somatic side, the body side, and then back to the heart. Now, the cool thing about crocodiles is this structure here. You might have been wondering. Crocodiles have a way of doing what we call shunting their blood, or they shunt their blood. Basically, they can, instead of sending this blood in the right ventricle to the lungs, they can send this blood back through the body. Now, why would that be important? Well, here's the idea. Crocodiles tend to sit submerged, maybe with just their eyes up, maybe the nostrils up, maybe not. And they can stay underwater for a long period of time. Also remember that when I told you about deoxygenated blood is not completely unsaturated with oxygen. In other words, it doesn't have all its oxygen gone. By it shunting the blood away from the lungs, it's not sending the blood back to the lungs, it's sending it back around in the circuit. So hopefully more oxygen can be pulled out. This gives the opportunity for this organism, these crocodiles, these alligators, to stay underwater a long period of time. Now, they cannot be moving around a lot. They can't be very aggressive underwater using this. And it's not like they think in their brain, oh, I'm going to shunt my blood away from the lungs into the body. But it is a physiological mechanism. It's a thing inside their heart that allows them to spend more time without having to take breaths, as long as they sit quietly underneath. That poor little gazelle, or that poor little human being that's sitting on the side of the river, muddy water, this crocodile's been under there for 30 minutes, all of a sudden lifts up out of the water, grabs a big gust of air, and then just charges after you, drags you under, and then the rest you can kind of gather from there. Dual circuit, 4-chambered, has a special shunt that allows it to move blood back through the body again, help pull some more of that oxygen out, help pull more of that carbon dioxide out of those tissues. Very unique, very interesting heart. Our next heart is going to be a human heart. Alrighty, so here is our human heart, and you should start seeing the chambers pretty easily here. I'm just going to abbreviate this because you should have it down. Here's our right atrium. Here's our vena cava. Now our vena cava has we're going to label the different pieces. If you remember when we talked about anatomy terms, we have inferior and superior. So this particular vena cava is going to be the inferior vena cava, because it pulls the blood from basically below the heart, below the diaphragm if you were talking about humans, down. That's the blood coming up from the legs and from the abdomen up to the heart. And then you have the superior vena cava, and that's pulling the blood from the head and the arms, the upper body regions. All the blood is still deoxygenated. We're going to go from that right atrium to that right ventricle. Again, I just abbreviated it. Then it's going to come right on out, the pulmonary artery. And you notice it splits because the heart is sitting in between the lungs. So we're going to go to the left lung into the right lung. I'm just going to write lungs up here so that we know that the blood goes out there to the lungs. We get gas exchange to occur. The blood is then going to turn around and come back to the heart so it can be pumped through the rest of the circuit, back to the left atrium, and then to the left ventricle. Now this diagram doesn't really do the heart justice. Again, it's a 2D picture. This right ventricle is a lot thinner and a lot smaller chamber than the left ventricle. And that's because the left ventricle is then going to pump the blood through the artery out to the different parts of the body. So it's got to pump the blood all the way to the head, all the way to the feet, and then also all the way back to the heart as it goes through its process. I also need you to see this piece right here. This piece right here, this is called the aortic arch. It's A-R-C-H there. It's just hard to see. And if you notice, it comes up and it curves to the left. It comes out of this chamber and goes up and curves to the left. This first vessel is going to feed the right arm and the right side of the head. This next vessel is going to feed the left side of the head, and this next vessel is going to feed the left arm. When people complain that their left arm feels numb or the left side feels numb right before they're having a heart attack, it's because the right side, at least the upper right side, the arm and the right side of the head, has received some oxygen, or probably has received some oxygen, and there's just not enough pressure because we're having a heart attack. We're having a cardiac event, so we're not going to see as much pressure, as much blood getting down to the ends of those structures there on the left-hand side. So this is why people, oh, my left arm hurts, oh, I'm having a heart attack. Once the blood gets down to the body, it's going to come back through the inferior and superior vena cava back to the right atrium. So again, we're having a dual circuit pump. We have a circuit where the right atrium and the right ventricle feed the lungs, the pulmonary side, and then the blood coming back from the lungs and sent to the body is handled by the left atrium and the left ventricle. So that's the somatic side. Blood has to go through the heart twice before it completes the complete cycle of pulmonary and somatic circuit, or pulmonary and somatic circuit. 4 chambers: right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. 4-chambered dual circuit pump. Left-handed circulation, because the aortic arch curves to the left when it comes right out of that left ventricle. This is the mammalian, or the human heart. And the next one we're going to do is going to be the bird heart. And what's interesting about this bird heart is it's just like the human heart. There is very little difference, or at least as far as what you guys need to know. But notice this aortic arch here on the human heart. Here's that same arch, but notice it's going the other direction. Birds still have 4 chambers. We still have a right atrium and a right ventricle. We still have pulmonary artery. We still have pulmonary veins coming back from the lungs to the left atrium and left ventricle. And we do have our aortic arch here, sending blood out to the body. But in birds, their aorta curves to the right. So we still have our dual circuit pump. We still have our 4 chambers. And the interesting thing here is that instead of their heart curving to the left, or at least their aorta curving to the left, it curves to the right. It's actually opposite. And that has to do with the structure of the lungs inside the bird. There are some very special structures there. They have air sacs, and you'll need to see another lesson or another video where I describe the breathing in birds. This is it. You got to know the circuits. You got to know which heart has how many chambers. You've got to know how many circuits that heart has, or how many times the blood goes through that heart So if it's a single circuit or a dual circuit pump, so that you can kind of get to the point where you can understand the physiology here. It's incredibly important that you understand this for when you move on to AP or IB bio, and we start talking about some other physiological things that have to do with the movement of gases and materials into and out of the circulatory system. That's it for this particular video.